Good evening, everyone. How are you? I'm Brian Rathbun. I'm the director of the Trudeau Center for Peace, Conflict, and Justice. And I'm excited to be here tonight to continue the tradition of the Frank Woods Lectureship series, but also to award, what we'll start with is we're going to award the Frank Woods Medal for outstanding achievement by one of our University of Toronto PCJ undergraduates. But first I want to tell you a little bit about Frank Woods, the namesake of both this honor that we're bestowing on this great university student, but also the lectureship series. Frank Woods, as we've taken to calling him here Uncle Frank because his great nephews are so involved in maintaining his legacy, one of them we have here. Frank Woods was a Toronto-born accountant, born in 1912, veteran of the Second World War, lifelong member of the city's professional and civic community. And from what we hear from his family, some of who I mentioned are here today, just an amazing human being, I think, first and foremost. Frank was educated at the University of Toronto, where he earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in 1935. During the Second World War, Frank's service took him to the United Kingdom and later to the battlefields of Northwest Europe. Like many Canadians of his generation, his wartime experience formed an important chapter of his life and connected him to a generation defined by sacrifice and duty. In addition to his professional achievements, Frank was recognized with membership in the Order of St. John, which is an international charitable order dedicated to humanitarian service. And he died in 2009 at the age of 96. He was known among his family, among other things, for his incredible storytelling, but also for his doodling ability. And we have an example here of one of the little things that he scrolled off from time to time, which I thought was particularly apropos of our moment here. As we can see, tariffs and customs are something that has bothered us for a very, very long time. In this case, it's the Canadians who are putting this particular man through his paces for what we can see is smuggling, I'm guessing, two American suits that he purchased in Kansas City across the border. So let's start, though, with the Frank Woods Medal. It's intended for a student who's made an outstanding contribution to the Peace, Conflict, and Justice program during their academic career at the University of Toronto. And this year's recipient is William Wang, who we have here today. Among his many accomplishments, I see that his CV lists 15 A+ marks in his courses, which is just extraordinary, and reminds me how lucky I am to have been born when I was born, when a B in your international relations course could end you up right here where I'm speaking you today. He is considering offers from various master's degree programs for the study of political science and international relations, and he's originally from Vancouver, I've just learned. And last summer did field research in China, funded by the Asian Institute here at the Munk School on China's policies of sustainable development. In any case, we'd like to recognize him for his tremendous academic and service achievements here at the university. We're also giving him, it comes with a cash prize of 650 Canadian dollars. In any case, so drinks are on William if he's old enough to buy drinks, which I think he is in this country. Anyways, William, please come up here. We'd like you just to say remarks. We don't actually have a medal. The medal is in the form of cash, which we have assumed that students want more than a medal that's not worth $650. So come on up here, William. Everyone, let's give a warm round of applause for him.
Thank you, Professor Rathbun. I'll be accepting that $600,000 shortly, and drinks are on me if that payment comes through. That being said, I'm very incredibly honored to be the medal recipient this year of the Frank Woods Medal. I'm currently in my 4th year of undergraduate studying peace, conflict, and justice studies here at the Munk School, and I've been told to prepare a quote-unquote very brief statement. But a brief statement wouldn't incredibly do justice to the help that I've gotten from the Trudeau Center across the years, but I'll do my very best to keep this incredibly short. With that said, the PCJ program here under the Trudeau Center has been a catalyzing effect on my career, and the faculty and staff both have been so incredibly supportive throughout my degree. This entire time here at the Trudeau Center has really helped me learn how to hone my skills, both academic and professional, and I'm incredibly grateful to be part of this program where I can call so many professors and a lot of my classmates as close friends and people I can count on to help me through understanding and navigating tough times. With addition to that, I'm also incredibly grateful for the Trudeau Center for all the incredible events that it puts together, such as this, that I've attended over the course of the last 4 years, and has really helped shape as well a sense of security and belonging here and community to really get a better sense of where our world is at and understand how we can come together to make it, hopefully, a better place. Normally, I would go on more and more about how these incredible professors, who I would love to name by name, and every single classmate and every staff that has helped me through the research that I've done and helped me through finding different pathways to navigate through, I think, a tough time in history, but keeping it short and in the nature of keeping it brief, I would just like to say again, thank you so much for the Trudeau Center. Thank you very much for the Frank Woods family and for events just like this. And I'm again incredibly honored to be a recipient of this year's medal. And so thank you once again. Very much appreciated.
Okay, so our next, what we want to do next is we want to turn to the Frank Woods Lecture Series. So that was initiated with a generous bequest by Frank Woods to feature an internationally recognized scholar within the field of political science and relevant to the goals of the Trudeau Center. But today we want to do something a little bit different. Rather than having a lecture from an outsider, and instead we'll have a conversation, and rather than importing a speaker from outside, I thought we would feature our own talent here. So in that case, or in this particular case, our fabulous political science faculty member, Madison Schramm, who last year published an excellent but also extremely timely book called Why Democracies Fight Dictators. I've invited her for a conversation here with me and also with you, because we'll be passing out the note cards as we often do, so that you can write down questions for either Maddie or myself. Anyways, her book received an honorable mention for the Best Book Award of the Foreign Policy section of the International Studies Association last year. We also have copies for sale, and so I'm noticing a fair number of people who are not students here who have no excuse not to support our poor faculty members here at the university by purchasing their excellent books. Maddie agrees. Anyways, so the idea for the event is that we wanted to consider the momentous changes that we're undergoing right now in light of our experience of the past. Since World War II, we've been operating under a certain conventional wisdom, rightly or wrongly, in international relations, that whatever momentary fluctuations we might see, we could still count on a stable pattern of relations amongst democracies. Both in a negative sense, that those democracies don't fight each other, don't go to war with each other, but also in a more positive, cooperative sense. And those democracies got along very well with one another, but they didn't necessarily have great relations with the autocracies of the world. In the academic literature, there's a phenomenon that is known as the democratic peace, which is an empirical finding that democracies simply don't fight one another, at least at high levels of conflict historically, even though they don't demonstrate a high degree of pacificness vis-à-vis autocracies. That is to say, democracies are not inherently peaceful, they're inherently peaceful with one another. But since 1945, democracies haven't just refrained from fighting one another, they've engaged in extensive cooperation that's led academics to invent new terms to describe the nature of their relations, such as security community. And this community is more than just a set of transacting partners pursuing their interests. There's a deep social bond among democracies, particularly the transatlantic democracies, an important point to which I'll return a little bit later. So this notion of a particular democratic zone of peace really reached its apex in the 1990s, but it's been under strain since, and lately seems to have really collapsed. The last few years have called this democratic peace, particularly that positive sense of the democratic peace, that cooperative sense, into question, given the increasing friction amongst democracies, some rather strange cooperation between democracies and autocracies, which academics call the Trump bromances, and what looks like more intense cooperation amongst autocracies themselves, particularly China and Russia. But before we perform an autopsy, I wanted to ask Maddie to describe the particular manifestation of the democratic peace that we saw after 1945, which is the subject of her book, and which was particularly aggressive vis-à-vis a certain type of autocratic state, which she'll explain to you. And from there, what I thought we'll do is I'll offer some thoughts about the challenges we see from within the community of democracies themselves. And then the two of us will have a conversation and then draw you in about the implications of Maddie's research to the events in recent months and nay, in recent days, notably the war against Iran. So with that, I'll ask Maddie to join me up here at the table and have her offer some remarks based on her research. Yeah, of course. What you're supposed to be.
I don't know over here.
No. I'm even going to pour you water.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today on an unfortunately timely topic. I think we say in international relations, generally when our field is hot, the world tends not to be so good. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my recent book, Why Democracies Fight Dictators, and then I'm excited to talk about the contemporary implications, what we're seeing today with the recent action of the US in Venezuela and Iran among European partners, and what we might be able to expect going forward. So as Brian mentioned, I start with a puzzle. We know from the democratic peace theory that democracies tend not to go to war with one another. But we also know, as he said, that they're just as conflict prone. Most of the literature in international relations and policy analysts have tended to focus on this dynamic, right? The relatively pacific relations among democracies. But if we know democracies are just as conflict prone, this kind of begs the question, who do democracies fight and why? Well, since 1945, if we think about who have been the villains, who have been the states that liberal democracies have defined themselves against, oftentimes US foreign policy and internationally among liberal democracies, foreign policy has been defined against the threat of charismatic authoritarian leaders. We can think of Mao, Pol Pot, Stalin, Gaddafi, just to name a few. So what is it about these leaders that makes them so dangerous? And their threats seem so all-consuming. Well, international relations and a tradition going back to ancient Greece has an answer. So it suggests that the lack of institutional constraints among these charismatic authoritarian leaders makes them inherently more dangerous, right? And so the fact that these leaders tend to be personalist regimes, which is defined often in the comparative politics literature as a leader who enjoys undisputed power and prominence, that those lack of constraints make them more dangerous. They're more conflict prone, they're more aggressive. But this can't account for the fact that liberal democracies initiated the vast majority of conflicts with personalist regimes. So I look into why. So I argue that rather than institutional configurations per se, so rather than the institutions, the Congress, the judiciary, the separation of powers, this is really about perceptions and ideology. So I argue that liberal democracies have a particular cognitive process that predisposes them to perceive personalist leaders as more acute threats. And I focus on three variables in this cognitive process: heuristics or cognitive shortcuts, ideology, and lastly, emotion, and particularly how they interact. And I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking through each of these and how they interact, before mentioning the other aspects of the book, particularly how I try to test this theory. So the first I start with are these heuristics or cognitive shortcuts. So two are particularly relevant. The first is the vividness effect, and this has been studied in political psychology and sociology as well as political science. And it's fairly intuitive. It's basically that tangible information tends to be weighed more heavily. And this makes sense, right? When we can come up with examples, when we can think of something as more concrete, we're more likely to give that more salience in our decision making. And the second is the attribution bias, something that I think tends to be more familiar to folks, or the tendency to blame an individual for something rather than environmental constraints or structure, so to focus on something inherent in their character or person that is to blame. And we can think about why these might be particularly relevant when considering threats against personalist regimes. First of all, the symbols of these regimes, these charismatic leaders, tend to be highly prominent and really available for effective imprinting. And they also are an easy target for blame. So these cognitive shortcuts might facilitate a disproportionate focus on these personalist leaders. The problem is these cognitive biases are theoretically universal, right? So why would it be that only liberal democracies are perceiving these threats as more acute and targeting personalist regimes more frequently? If this was something to do with cognitive biases specifically, then we would expect other autocratic regimes, flawed democracies to also be targeting these personalist regimes more. But we don't see that. We see it's just the liberal democracies. And I argue this is because biases are constituted by identity. What we fear, what we loathe, the vivid examples we can actually come up with that I just mentioned, all of this is conditioned by socio-political examples tied to memory. And I argue that in the United States, after 1945 in particular, a social identity took hold that really defined the canonical foes of liberal democracies as these personalist adversaries. So rather than situating this in the institutions of either the autocratic regime or the democracy, I argue that this has become a part of the political culture in liberal democracies, and one that leaders tend to truly and sincerely believe. And so after the Second World War, and the genocide in particular, between memorials, maps, experience of combat, policymakers and the public alike started to identify these individual dictators as antithetical to this liberal democratic identity. And in doing so, this augments the aforementioned cognitive biases. And oftentimes in international relations and even policy discussions, we stop there, right? We get to increased threat perception, and that's the ballgame. But that actually doesn't get us to kinetic action, right? So when we think about how threat perception affects policy decision-making, we can think of fight or flight. So why is it when policymakers experience an increased threat, they decide to fight instead of backing away? So there's nothing actually that would dictate that we would respond to these threats in a particular way. But I argue that within this cognitive process, anger is particularly salient and can explain why we get from this increased threat to increased coercive action from the liberal democracies. And this is because there are three characteristics of anger that suggest they'd be particularly salient in these contexts. So the first is that anger tends to be focused outwardly rather than inwardly. So it's been closely tied in studies to attributional processes. So we're more likely to experience anger when we are attributing blame. The second is that violations of norms are more likely to spur anger. And if democracy, liberal democracy, as I'm suggesting, is the salient social identity, then we would expect these personalist dictators to present normative threats. And lastly, and most importantly, anger has been tied to preferences for coercive action. So studies in interstate and intrastate conflict have shown that the experience of anger is more likely to increase support for different types of coercive action. So these variables, even though I'm trying to delineate them, are actually interacting. We know that when we consider any given stimuli or we encounter a stimuli, we don't kind of go through our emotional expression, cognitive biases, and identity. These things are all happening at the same time. But cumulatively, I suggest that they result in an increased frequency or tendency to target personalist regimes among liberal democracies. And so in the book, I test this in a few different ways. So the first is the big observable implication, right? We would expect liberal democracies to target personalist regimes more and other types of states to be no more likely to target them. So I find looking at different types of conflict and different measures of democracy and authoritarianism that this is the case, that liberal democracies in particular are more likely to target these regimes. You might be saying, well, maybe these personalist regimes are actually targeting these liberal democracies as well. But I find that other types of autocratic states are actually somewhat more likely than personalist regimes to target these liberal democracies. So this can explain the trend, that we're simply responding to the aggression of personalists. You might also say that, well, these personalists tend to be bad actors, and so maybe they're causing trouble even if liberal democracies aren't the direct sort of target of that. But including additional measures, I find that this also can't explain the effect. In other words, the tendency for liberal democracies to target these personalist regimes isn't tied to other types of troublemaking among these personalist regimes. And so if it is this cognitive process, if I'm right that there's something about this, how do I test this? So I look at two cases, the Suez Crisis and the First Gulf War, from the perspectives of the US government and the British to see how they weighed different types of information, how they assessed the threats from Gamal Abdel Nasser and Saddam Hussein, respectively, and how this seemed to affect decision-making. And what I find, as I suggested in my argument, is that these leaders played a really important role in how the president's policy officials and the public articulated the threats, so much so that oftentimes these leaders became shorthand for the conflict themselves. And this seemed to drive these leaders to pursue coercive action. And in the case of both the Suez Crisis and the Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein wasn't ousted, nor was Gamal Abdel Nasser, this pushed Middle East policy to pursue regime change in these cases for successive years until these leaders were either ousted or died. And so one of the important implications that I'm looking forward to talking to Brian about here is that if trends in regime type and conflict behavior aren't purely a matter of institutional configuration, but of ideology, of psychology, and individual leaders, this might have particularly important implications as we're witnessing democratic backsliding around the globe, and clearly an erosion of this liberal identity I describe in the book. So, that wasn't
Yes, please clap. Is there like a teleprompter that I don't see? You just did that out the top of your head just to make me look bad because I got my notes here and like I'm gonna use a script and I'm still gonna fumble it. And anyways, excellent way to start us off. So what I thought with my remarks, what I want to do is ask the question, particularly in light of both Maddie's book and recent events. What does the democratic peace look like when the commitment to liberal values from within democracies comes into question? Not so much here, but in other certain North American countries led by orange men. Really, when we say democracy, we're talking about liberal values, right? The various populist demagogues question not so much democracy in the sense of elections, but rather notions of individual liberties such as speech, expression, or protest, as well as other features of liberal democracy, the rule of law, even the importance, I would say, of science. So I think of liberalism generally as a commitment to reason. And there's long been a debate, which you referred to in the academic literature, about what underpins this democratic peace. Its institutions, or which is really its formal system of government, its constitutions, right, or its culture. And Maddie's book really is situated in the latter, I would say, although draws in psychology to buttress cultural accounts. But the implication is that if one's self-understanding as a leader is no longer being a democratic leader, or if the autocratic nature of enemies no longer bothers you, right, then the pattern of relations amongst democracies and autocracies will change, even if the institutions don't. Another way of putting it, the more authoritarian a democratic leader becomes, the less we might believe that leader is committed to the democratic peace, and the less that that leader has a problem with the autocracies or even the personalist dictators of the world. And so I think that also means that autocratically minded leaders in democracy will be less likely to back other liberal democracies and less likely to go to war with autocracies because they're autocracies, although they might do so for other reasons. And of course, they might be willing to cooperate with them in ways that we would have previously thought beyond the pale. So I think the most notable example for me is Trump and Putin. I think it's unthinkable before Trump that the US would actively take sides with Russia against a besieged democracy, Ukraine. It might retain a policy, for instance, of strategic ambiguity, as the case with Taiwan, but kind of selling someone out or putting the finger on the scale in favor of the autocratic country was not something that was thought possible in American foreign policy, I would say, since 1945, or at least as long as I've been born. Anyways, alongside this concern about authoritarian-minded leaders in what used to be stable democracies, we also see emerging, I would say, a fundamental conflict about what it means to be Western. The democratic peace post-1945 was predicated on a particular understanding of the West. It was largely paternalistic, one in which the democracies of the world would defend the rest of the world against aggressors. Their leaders talk frequently of civilization, with civilization defined in terms of a commitment to liberal values. But what went understood and unmentioned was an assumption really that it was white Europeans and North American countries who were proper democracies, right? And I think this might have changed, but I still have found in my own work, my own research on public opinion in the United States and the United Kingdom, contemporary public opinion, that support for the democratic peace, that is, support for democracies over autocracies, is driven by a particular subset of these populations who demonstrate more or report more ethnocentrism. And it's largely a function of the racial signals that they pull out when you tell them the country they're facing is a democracy or an autocracy. So this is still a thing, right? At least amongst the public, even if less so amongst elites. My interpretation of that finding of my own is the one that seems most plausible, is not necessarily an antipathy on the part of these ethnocentric individuals towards non-white countries for their race per se, but rather a more paternalistic one in which white democracies are thought to be more truly democratic, and therefore more deserving of that, of being in the democratic club. Democracy is what we want everyone to have, but some just aren't up to it. Now, what's more disturbing to me, though, is the much more explicit conception of the West being offered by elements of the new right, not as one marked by the cultural heritage of liberalism, even if it's only or predominantly confined to European countries or white countries, but rather a really blunt racism that hides, if it does, behind notions of Christianity. The new right is talking more about Western civilization than I've seen in decades. But by Western civilization, it doesn't mean liberalism. It harkens back really to a time when Western countries were white and Christian. And really before democratic revolutions swept Europe at all, or in the past. So when Trump, or the national security strategy of the United States for that matter, says that Europe is unrecognizable, this is not so much of a racial dog whistle, but really a racial dog bark, I would say. And this shift, I think, begins about 20 years ago, maybe a little less, with the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, as a vision offered against both a progressive and tolerant Europe, but also a multicultural one. And to my astonishment, this spreads not just across the far right in Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe, and now to the United States as well. On this side of the Atlantic, I see Vice President J.D. Vance as embodying this most clearly. the notion that Western solidarity, which we see explicitly in the most recent American national security strategy, is the West means a common racial heritage and commitment to a kind of, I would say, extreme cultural conservatism, not just cutting taxes or anything like that, but something more radically authoritarian. And this same national security strategy calls into question the NATO alliance, tying it to demographic changes in Europe. Its growing diversity, both ethnic and religious, right? That we're simply just not part of the same family anymore if we don't share not this commitment to liberal values, but this commitment to this other conception of being Western. And to the extent that this goes further, I think it's going to transform the nature of the transatlantic alliance. I think it leads from a transatlanticism marked by incredible consultation amongst allies to one in which interference in the internal politics of other members of the alliance in favor of particular transnational ideological allies becomes the norm. So again, I can make reference to the ways in which the US has made it its business to support and complain about the treatment of far-right parties in Western and Eastern Europe, which is the only parallel that I can find in my understanding of West European and transatlantic history is the way in which Europe's monarchies collectively conspired in the 1800s to repress dangerous nationalist and self-determination movements in the 1800s that were thought to be a threat to all of the monarchies. So, anyways, that's where I thought some of my initial thoughts. But first, I want to turn to some questions about about your book, which is well. First of all, let's put some meat on the bones because this understanding of what personalism is. What's a personalist dictator as opposed to a different type of dictator? Just to give us some, or autocracy, I should say. Is it the same thing as a dictator? Is it the same thing as an autocracy? It's not. It's a specific time. So tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely.
Who's the enemy, or who was the enemy for a long period of time?
Definitely. So different scholars, especially in comparative politics, have organized the different types of authoritarian regimes. So when we think about what makes a democracy or an autocracy, institutionally, we can think of the freedom of the press, suffrage, civil rights, and liberties. Oftentimes, autocracies are defined simply as the absence of these different characteristics. But comparative politics scholars in, I say recent years, but actually past 30 years or so, have been looking at other ways to classify the variation between these different types of autocratic regimes. One of which is by looking at their executive institutional configuration. So who makes the decisions? Who's the decision body? Who has ultimate authority in the regime? Is it a group of military folks, in which case we might think of it as a junta? Is it a single individual at the helm, which would be a personalist regime, who has undisputed power and authority? Is it a single-party dictatorship like China, where we think the party is sort of the center of authority? The other configuration is, multi-party dictatorship, in which case there are uncompetitive or rigged elections, but theoretically or in practice multiple parties. And lastly, monarchies, right, that have some sort of hereditary process of succession. So all of these different regimes are authoritarian, but they have different structures in terms of who holds power and who represents the regime, right? Who's the figurehead, right? In a military, it might be, we might know who the general is or the individuals responsible, but we tend to be able to think of Putin individually, of Saddam Hussein, of these individual personalist leaders. And so that's one of the things that differentiates this, is who the decision maker is and where the authority in the regime lies. Most famously, I draw on Barbara Geddes' work, who differentiates these.
Okay, and so give us so Hitler, personalist dictator or not?
Yes, personalist dictator.
Okay, Stalin?
Stalin, personalist, but there's also variation over time, which is important to note. So even though you might have one leader over a period of time, I'm more familiar with Mao in this case.
Okay.
there are periods where he had more control and less control, and some periods when he was so, I would say, unempowered that the regime classification changed to party or to a group rather than to a personalist regime.
And some people are saying that's happening in China now, right?
Yes.
Right, that China is moving more towards a personalistic system.
And this is interesting. I think we're at a point where China and we're always 5 or 10 years behind in our data sets, right?
Yeah.
So I actually don't know what although we have some folks who put together these data sets who are tweeting, which is really interesting to say what they think in the moment. But, if we look at what's happening right now with China and Xi, he's consolidating power, but he's also becoming more prominent in discourse, right? So, these things often tend to go hand in hand, but they don't always. And I think Iran is a good example of this, actually.
Okay, yeah, so Iran, Khomeini, may he rest in peace. I guess I probably shouldn't say that. That's the thing, like, what are you supposed to say about this person, right? I'm sorry you got decapitated, but I'm not sorry. So Khomeini, no, right? Or yes?
Yeah, so one of the reasons, and actually the puzzle for my book came out of interest I had in U.S. foreign policy toward Iran at the time. And this is just a little by way of background. I was living in New York City, and Iran is, by most measures, a personalist regime with a supreme leader in charge. That being said, very unusually, the supreme leader was more of a private and religious actor, right? So we didn't see him. They had cardboard cutouts that they would kind of bring around off airplanes sometimes, but he wasn't highly visible. And in 2003, actually, from 2008 to 2013, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was the president in Iran. And he came to New York in this period famously, and there were these billboards on subways, and there was one in Times Square, and it had a picture of him next to a mushroom cloud that said, "We have to stop Iran." And he got wall-to-wall coverage. And I found this fascinating because he didn't control the nuclear program.
Yeah.
He didn't control foreign policy. And he actually, at that point, had fallen out with the supreme leader and had limited power domestically. But he became the focal point or the symbol for this animosity toward the regime.
I mean, literally the face, right?
Literally the face,
Literally
absolutely.
the face.
So much so I checked the congressional record, and folks in the U.S. in office at the time in that period mentioned Ahmadinejad about 4 times more frequently than they did the supreme leader, right? And so I think this goes to show the kind of relationship between institutional configuration versus kind of emotional imprinting and perception.
Right. Other examples, Janice Stein, personalist dictator?
Benevolent dictator.
Benevolent dictator. That's not in the typology.
She gets it in her own category.
Okay. All right, so what's so interesting about the book is that it's taking this thing that we oftentimes think it's a thing, the democratic piece. It goes back to as long as there's been democracies, and then it works the same way as it does in the early 1800s, ostensibly as it does now. And you're basically saying, no, we need to understand the democratic piece as changing over time, and the particular shape and form it takes post-1945 is a unique one. Right, that's driven by a set of oftentimes historical experiences of that particular war. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's what one of the things I find great about the book is, right. You're not falling into the trap of saying the democratic piece is just the same thing over and over and over, when we know that these countries changed tremendously over this wide swath of time. So how does this particular understanding, which I would say it's a kind of a narrative, right, about good democracies, bad personalist dictators, how does this come into being as you see it?
It's a great question. And this was something I found really interesting thinking about some of the data and conversations. I think, and to be fair, that really were more prominent in the 90s about the U.S. having been a democracy since 1776, when in fact we know, right, looking at everything from enslavement to Jim Crow, to, some of the contemporary challenges we'll get into, there are some limitations to this. And I drew on some of the work in the last 5 or 10 years by Duncan Bell, who's a political theory professor at Cambridge, who's done a lot of really fascinating deep dive work into the history of liberalism. And one of the things I used to want to get my PhD in political theory, but I knew I couldn't succeed, so, IR. And I was really fascinated by how, Kant and Locke and these thinkers associated with the Enlightenment and liberalism, right, though we've retained them over time, we've really written out their oftentimes explicit imperial or support for these very undemocratic practices. Locke, for example, worked on the Constitution for the Colony of Carolina. It's just one example. And so we know these things have changed over time, the norms associated with liberalism. And actually the prominence of liberalism in political and social discourse has changed quite a bit. So in the interwar period between the First and Second World War, we actually start to see liberalism retrojected back to be this sort of all-encompassing narrative of democracies and autocracies. But actually, one of the things Bell points to in his work is that philosophy and political science textbooks in Cambridge and in the US actually didn't have any mention of liberalism up until the interwar period, right? And so despite the fact that this has come to be understood as this is the natural state of things, these are the canonical foes, this is really something that has been constructed over time. And so in this interwar period, we have also this consensus emerge between Christian scholars and Marxists, folks who worked on the League of Nations, coming together to develop and articulate a form of liberalism that was especially associated with democracy and identified authoritarianism as antithetical to that. And this, really resonated with narratives of tyranny in the United States, sort of dating back to, invocations of King George and more contemporary movements. In the aftermath of the Second World War, we also see scholars and practitioners, and World War II was particularly unprecedented in how, of course, the number who served, but also how these folks came out of service, went into the academy and into political office, or from the ISS into the CIA, as it were, and then back to academia. And in these cases, so from Hannah Arendt to Brzezinski, they're theorizing fascism, totalitarianism, and what are the different parameters of these? And one of the things I found really interesting is that even though these were theorized in slightly different ways, what they shared was a charismatic authoritarian leader. And this became sort of constructed and understood, and as it was in the Second World War, a very real existential threat. And this was sustained through, again, this memorialization and narratives, but also generations of policymakers.
Right. And tell us about how far this reaches, because your book is about the US and the UK. And it does seem like I'm just curious, is this true in France? It's not true in Germany in the same way. Probably because you've got all these different histories, but it really seems to be, it's really driven by the U.S. and the U.K. Would you say, right? So for instance, how does Canada fit into that, right? Because Canada doesn't go slaying monsters across the world, and it could just be, well, you have to have a certain capacity as well as addition a particular story, and Canadians we feel the same way about that bad guy, but could you go take care of him for us? Is it, or is there just something weirdly Anglo-Saxon about this particular story?
That's an interesting question. So I looked at these dynamics a little bit with the French with regard to the Suez Crisis and the First Gulf War, and I found, especially in the Suez Crisis, Moulet, his use of analogies and references to Nasser, and of course the French were part of the action in the Suez Crisis, was very much articulating a similar kind of ideational frame. We didn't see this during the Gulf War. Part of this was the Gaullist legacy. Part of this was France, trying to distance itself from the United States. But the archival evidence I looked at does indicate at the same time they conceptualized Saddam Hussein in similar terms.
They just didn't want to say it because it would be because it'd be agreeing with the Americans.
Exactly.
Which is, you can't do.
Yeah,
not publicly.
It's tasteless. With Canada, I think this is absolutely true, right? So there is a bias toward great powers or countries that have the capacity, right? The US and the UK in these periods, obviously overwhelming military powers. With Canada, you see similar dynamics during the first Gulf War. I didn't look in depth at sort of the Canadian perspective during during the Suez Crisis. We'd expect this to be different in Germany, in part because of the Cold War and ultimately reunification and the narratives, and of course as aggressor within the Second World War, to be quite different. But in Western Europe, I found evidence of this in a number of different cases. That being said, I think this has been led by the United States and the British, and their ability not only to conduct military operations much more extensively than these other countries, but also their ability to set the kind of cultural and normative agenda.
I mean, it's almost part of the special relationship itself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, World War II, why do you think that World War II was, so the way I always thought about World War II is, it's like a superhero magazine.
Yes.
Written,
Yeah.
right? It has all the elements. It has, an almost ridiculous, almost like a caricature of a bad guy, right? Who does unspeakable things that no one thought was possible, even amongst the worst human beings of all times, right? Do you think we could have? You think that the experience of the war itself, was that just central to the development of this particular hostility? Because what we see in your case studies show this all is right. There's a lot of Hitler comparisons. There's a lot of fascist comparisons too. There's a lot like Nasser's the new Mussolini.
Yeah, more Mussolini than I'd guess.
Yeah, yeah. But talk about that, because the analogies are a key way by which you trace the role that history plays, right? But it's also very recent analogies. It's the people who just went through this, or at least came of age at the time where these were the salient figures in their mind, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think in World War II, it's the decimation of Western Europe, the number of casualties lost, the atomic bomb being dropped, I think for all sorts of reasons. But especially, as you pointed out, this is the good war, right, in the memory. And so
it's you couldn't design a better war almost.
Yeah, this is, and there's...
I mean, in order to make yourself feel truly, like you are on the moral high ground.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is the righteous war, and this has been the war that, since they've been compared to when we talk about sort of the morals or ethics. So I think this played a really essential part, both in kind of, again, the memorialization or creating this really salient reference point. And I think it codified a lot of intellectual and social development of this kind of idea of liberalism. But these analogies did play a really central role, in part because when we talk about World War II or Vietnam or the Falklands War, whatever the conflict may be, and we say, well, this is like this. Well, of course, these conflicts, especially something like World War II, are extremely complex and long, but these analogies come to take on certain meanings. So Munich 1938, the lesson is you can't appease dictators, right? Hitler, the analogy becomes, right, you are standing up to an existential threat. This is not just an ordinary interlocutor in international relations, but this is someone who threatens the status quo and civilization, the world writ large. So with both Mussolini and Hitler, in the Suez Crisis, what was interesting is Eisenhower was in power in the United States, who was the Supreme Allied Commander during the Second World War, so he himself obviously had combat experience. Anthony Eden played an important role and actually resigned from the administration in the UK because of what he saw as Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler. So for him, this was particularly salient as well. And so when we hear these comparisons to Mussolini and Hitler among Eden and Eisenhower, they're not just these vague historical reference. They're very real personal experiences of death and destruction. What's interesting is that these persist into the first Gulf War. And so the number of times I traced I think in the book in the introduction, in one speech that George W. Bush used Hitler in just the first 45 minutes of a speech. It was several dozen. And so for him, he was actually a very young naval pilot, one of the youngest, and he was shot down in the Second World War. Margaret Thatcher was at the helm in the UK, who was in college or in what we say their zeitgeist years, right? Turns out it really does matter. Your brains are, more conducive to new information right now, so take every opportunity. And these played a really seminal part in how they imagined international affairs. And in both cases, despite the fact that George H.W. Bush spent his career in politics at the UN, as vice president, at the CIA, he still relied on these analogies to World War II, even though Vietnam and the Falklands, right, there were other conflicts that should have been, at least temporally, more accessible. And similarly with Thatcher, right, these have remained. And I think the fact that we continue to hear them tells us something.
Yeah, and so that's where I want to go next, which is how long can this persist? Because one way of reading, as a bridge towards us talking more about whether this might be disappearing, whether you might have just discovered an epoch, right, as in active or in accurately characterizing at a time where its window was closing, right? It seems like there has to be a shelf life, right? When you're talking about people with no direct experience, right? So Uncle Frank, right, was 96 years old when he passed away, and that was 15 years ago. Was that right? Right. And was in the war, right? So how long can this persist? It's part of what I was always struck. What I always tried to tell students is like it's amazing how much work World War II does, considering how few people have direct experience of it. But eventually, do you think that eventually this, like, how robust is this particular social identity complex? Do you think? I mean, or is it one of these things where only time will tell?
I think that's a great question, and in part because it's constituted and reinforced by, right, these other complementary or contradicting narratives. But I will say I was at the airport last week and I walked by Relay or whatever it was, and there was The Economist with a picture of Khomeini in black and white and red all around him. I was like, oh no, because you see that magazine cover. I kid you not. Whatever dictator it is, there's trouble. And I can pull up the same one from Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi to, right? And so I think one of the ways that it's continued to be salient is because it is every, few years, it's being also replaced with these more maybe accessible images of Saddam Hussein, right, Gaddafi, again, just in my lifetime. I think we're seeing contestation within the administration. I think this administration, we can talk about this, has been socialized wildly differently than those before them. And if this is an identity, right, that matters tremendously for how they are going to perceive autocrats. So if in Washington, in the blob, as it's affectionately called, right? If you tune into any
not so affectionately
called, if you tune into any of these discussions, one of the interesting things that you hear is these narratives are still really commonly evoked among foreign policy elites. So within Congress and outside Congress. So I don't think it's dead, but I think it is really eroded and, to some extent contested, but dead inside this administration. And so I think a question I have that I wish I had an answer to is whether or not that's going to carry through, or, the fact that we see no king's protest, right, being such a focal point in the United States tells me that there's still something to this idea of resistance to autocrats.
And yet at the same time, we have our own personalist.
Yeah.
Someone who wants to be a personalist. And I say we because Maddie and I are both Americans by birth. We'll say.
Not by choice.
So Maddie shared with me this piece that she had, which I think is a draft piece, but I wanted to ask you about it. And she does this amazing analysis of the changes in the national security strategies of the United States in light of the argument in her book, right? So tell us a little bit about it, like the shift that we see most predominantly between the first Trump administration's national security strategy, the Biden on the one hand, and then a big break between that and the ways in which they do or do not invoke this democracy dictator contrast.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the national security strategy from the first Trump administration even though there was absolutely more emphasis not on U.S. domestic politics and kind of an America first, it was still using a lot of the same language regarding threats from different types of autocratic regimes, our interest, our partners. Again, less so than the previous one, but even though this departed in a few ways, it was, and you know, national security strategies oftentimes read a little bit like a wish list, kind of shrouded in, you know, kind of typical jargon. So, but they do give us a sense or a window into at least the ideological frame, the discourse that's being used to identify and think about world affairs, or what is on the wish list. The Biden administration, I would say, this was the democracy dictator conflict on overdrive. In fact, they narrow the field to personalist leaders, and they use the term personalist leaders, which shocked me. But I know someone who worked on that, so I think
really?
it might have been them.
Oh, okay.
As particular threats, they talked expansively about Putin, and unlike previous administrations, they actually named some of these personalist dictators as unique threats. In 2025, in the fall, we got the second Trump administration's national security strategy, and this, to a wild extent, was unlike anything I have ever seen.
I've never anything like it.
Anyone has ever seen. So it starts out. There's no mention of democracy, liberalism, or autocracy in this 50-page document, other than, I think, a critique of liberalism in Europe that's really about civilization and race, rather than liberalism per se. So they're not defining even their wish list, their ideas, the identity, the plan for the United States in these liberal terms anymore. This discourse is absent from the discussion. And in fact, this is a point of criticism for these other states that, you know, they might be focusing on this. So I think, to me, that was just startling how little this is animating their foreign policy decision-making, especially compared to their predecessor.
Yeah. So think about, what do you think about Trump, qua Trump, in these terms? Like, so what do you think? In a way, I see this whole experience, let's call it that, as kind of a validation of your argument, right? Because what happens when you put a personalist in charge of democracy? So that's my question for you.
Well, what happens?
Yeah, what happens when you put a personalist? Like, what happens to, like, how do personalists behave, right? And what about this makes sense with the idea of Trump as a personalist?
So Juan Linz has wrote about the perils of presidentialism. He's a comparative scholar. And he talked about how presidential democracies might actually be uniquely vulnerable to some of these dynamics, or to democratic backsliding, because of their institutional configuration. So I think in the United States, I'll say first, you know, there's a lot of different answers as to how we got here. Some, you know, and we all, I think, probably have a little bit of a different inflection. But one thing I think that's important is the institutions, but also the ideas that underpin them. Again, especially in the case of the Trump administration. So what does it mean that we have someone like Trump at the helm in the United States, someone who does not care or does not respect democratic processes, who one of the key dimensions of democracy is the peaceful transfer of power, obviously something that was upended on January 6th, who is violently suppressing Americans, throwing a lot of extremely brutal tactics. And so I think one of the things that we've unfortunately been learning is that, one of my students said this, America was running on vibes, right? It's the institutions weren't as strong as we thought they were, in part because folks bought into the norms and they were enacting those norms consistently within the institutions. But when you have someone who doesn't observe those, it turns out the institutions aren't as tough as we thought they are. And so I think, unfortunately, we're witnessing what has been the erosion of some of these really key institutions over the years, and how weak, unfortunately, they have actually become.
Yeah, the way in which I think that this works with your argument is that I think of Trump as a would-be personalist dictator, right? when I used to teach this to my students, like, what's a personalist dictator? And I was like, how do you know? And there's this big list of questions. And I was like, do you think the guy has a tiger in his house? Right? If he has a tiger in his house, he's a personalist dictator, right? Like, everything is about the collection of weird, strange things. It's all whims, right? And like, I don't know if Trump has a tiger, right? But I think he would think it's pretty cool. And so this is how. So okay, but how does a personalist dictator rule? And they don't think about things in terms of like democracies and non-democracies are not categories in their mind that they care about, right? And they probably care more about whether or not they probably conceive of actually the world in terms of the leaders. And we see this very much with Trump. I think Trump can't really distinguish between countries and their leaders, right? He assumes a kind of omnipotence on the part of all leaders, right? He doesn't really recognize that they have legislative practices. So anytime a country does something, it's always he identifies the particular leader, whether it be the poor Swiss prime minister or something like that, who's a very, very terrible person, by the way, I've been led to understand, right? Who's very, very mean with her, and her chocolates are terrible. Okay, let's talk about Iran.
Let's talk about Iran.
Let's talk about Iran. Okay, what kind of purchase do you think we get with these different concepts and arguments that we think about with Iran? Or are we in uncharted waters?
Good question. So if Iran was a personalist regime and Khomeini's gone, it's been assassinated, I think, and this may be, I do not think this was the motivation for why the United States targeted and is at war with Iran. I think this had to do with, and per their own explanation, right, 5 or 6 different reasons having to do with their ballistic missile program, having to do with their continued nuclear program, with their sponsorship, state sponsorship of terrorism, as well as the recent brutal repression. Although we don't hear a lot about democracy, you might notice, in this discourse. So even these kind of, support for the protesters, which we have heard from the administration, this hasn't been accompanied by the same type of liberal or liberalism emphasis on democracy and elections. So even though this was very much a targeting of a personalist regime, I think this has more to do with, say, timing, the interest of Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has wanted to do this for a very long time. The recent success in Venezuela, I think, showed the Trump administration what this could look like. Declining poll numbers, upcoming elections in both Israel and the midterms in the United States. I think there's a lot of different reasons. And as I say in the draft piece I shared, I think my explanation doesn't actually have much analytic purchase here, but I think that, trying to save it, that tells us something though, right? Because the fact that this isn't motivated by liberalism and liberal identity tells us about what the administration values and what drives them to war. And I don't think it's the same thing that has been doing the work for some time now.
Yeah, and the very fact that there's not even a pretense really of in the way that there was with the last Gulf War,
Yeah.
right, or the Iraq War, right? And even that came late, right? It was all about the weapons of mass destruction until it became about building democracy in Iraq, and it did feel a little bit like a pretense. But they went through the pretense, and they're not really bothering with the pretense at all, which is exactly what we expect from a government whose leaders don't really believe in the democratic peace, which is, or I think in the distinction between personalist dictatorships and not. I wanted to ask you about what do you think? You're careful in the book. There's not really a normative conclusion in the book, and that's fine. They don't want us to right.
Yeah.
But so. We should note attention here because we're all lamenting. So one of the questions is, when do we expect the world to go back to democratic peace? And I think I can't know the motivation behind the question, but it seems like I'd like that back, please. But there's a dark side to your finding. Would you say so?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say this, normative cards on the table, what motivated this. I mentioned this kind of puzzle with Iran, but the other was that, I was in high school when the United States went into Iraq in 2003. I watched U.S. action in Libya and Syria, and I think my argument, to the extent that, there's a normative dimension, is really that this produces suboptimal tendencies. If this increases threat perception so significantly, increases the tendency to prefer coercive action, we're likely to do so without a careful consideration of what comes next. We're more likely to focus on ousting a leader rather than building or supporting an opposition. And we saw this in Iraq. We saw this in Libya, unfortunately. And so my argument is that, and part of this also emerged, there's a tendency, understandably, to pathologize autocratic regimes, individual autocrats and also the states. But democracies aren't immune from making bad decisions. And in fact, there are pathologies that might characterize our foreign policy that produces trends in these bad decisions. Although I have to say, when I was Trump came to power while I was working on the dissertation, and it made me a little nostalgic for this type, because one of the things I say is, even though this produces different suboptimal tendencies, and I think there are better ways to rely on this ideational frame to pursue good in the world, policy and a foreign policy absolutely divorced from liberalism is very dangerous, and I think we're seeing that in the United States.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like there's a certain level of support that Trump, or that the Iran war is getting from like a Baptist bootlegger coalition. So I am noticing some like kind of neocons along the way are kind of like, well, he isn't a good guy, right? So like Bret Stephens, the who writes for the New York Times, right? He's like, we shouldn't lament the disappearance of this regime. It's a bad regime, anyhow. And so that could, but even though Trump's not in it for, or none of them, I think, are in it for actually helping the Iranian people at all, they could nevertheless find some level of support from those kind of aging neocons, I guess you could call them, right?
Absolutely. And is this public? Is this off the record?
I don't know. Is this being recorded? Oh, shit.
I was going to say, okay, so I'm going to pivot, but I was going to say a little bit. So there are folks who have been arguing for this for 30 years in the same papers in the New York Times and elsewhere. And I think this is, we are seeing the emergence, especially of this sort of evangelical core, this being a religious war being invoked actually among the military in the United States, which is, again, very dangerous. One of the things that I think is that you tend to see more in the policy community than in academia, maybe because we're a little more cynical, is that they tend to think, okay, he's out, good. Right? But actually, oftentimes we're in international relations, we're in the land of bad options.
Like, now what?
Right, exactly. And so it's not a question of, this was bad, therefore it should be gone. It's a question of, here are your bad options. And what is the least bad option? And this doesn't seem to be something that I think makes it through in a lot of those discussions. Absolutely, the regime is brutal. Has killed, God only knows how many people. This is in addition to the state sponsorship of terrorism, the threats internationally. But that being said, one of the things that we're seeing, and I don't know more than anyone else on this, but if the Supreme Leader's son is tapped, which some are suggesting he might be, right, we're going to see the same hardline ideology. And also, if politicians keep being killed, right, the IRGC is more and more likely to have more power, and they are not known for their moderation, right? And so thinking this through again, right, the land of bad options is important. So is it good that this person who caused so much chaos and destruction and devastation is gone? Absolutely. But could things get worse? Absolutely.
Did you observe historically, and then relative to the questions about Iran, like some kind of correlation between this personalization of these regimes and an inability to think about planning after the fact? Because this is what we did, like World War II notwithstanding. World War II is the genesis of these ideas, and yet at the same time, it's really our only, the Americans at least, or the West's, or NATO's, or however you want to put it, real success story in constructing countries from the ground up. like World War II, including Japan, Germany. Like, we've been chasing that model forever.
Yeah.
And so these people seem to have known, those people seem to have understood, like, oh, you have to go in there and you have to know how to do it. And maybe they just got lucky, I have no idea. But it does seem like after that, we have not been thinking about, or at least thinking the right way about post-conflict reconstruction. So do you think that's tied to this simplification of war as getting rid of one bad dude?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I think you can't understand 2003 and the U.S. invasion of Iraq without looking at 1990 and the fact that the United States didn't succeed in killing Saddam Hussein. Because despite the fact that there is an impression that the invasion of Iraq came out of nowhere, and do not get me wrong, it was obviously not connected to weapons of mass destruction. This had been in the works since 1990, 1991. The United States during the Gulf War targeted palaces and regime installations of Saddam Hussein. In fact, one of the reasons the coalition fragmented after the fact was because they were seen as going beyond their mandate and trying to target Saddam Hussein. There were several covert operations that tried to oust Saddam throughout the 90s, including a 1998 bombing campaign, at which point the Clinton administration actually made regime change the formal policy of the United States. So when 2003 comes around and the U.S. goes in, this is a continuation of a project that had been in the works for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And so I absolutely think this is true. And similarly with Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, one of the things I found in the book, which is interesting, is that although oftentimes the U.S. role in the Suez Crisis is depicted as one of Eisenhower's diplomatic acumen in de-escalating, actually the U.S. was pursuing covert foreign imposed regime change against Nasser throughout this period and continued to do so. And one of the reasons they were actually very frustrated with their British counterparts was because they thought that they should continue to pursue this covert line rather than overt action. And so, this obsession continued until Nasser died, so much so that anytime anything went awry, he tended to blame it on, an attempt to overthrow him, which, if Castro tells us anything, could have in fact been true.
So I want to get some questions from the floor. If liberal democracy is a core value in the foreign policy, or has been so before Trump, why does it confront some autocratic states, for example, Iran, while considering others allies, Saudi Arabia, UAE? So think about that. Like, how does that work?
Definitely. So I have this little model in the book, and I would say the scope condition is there's some conflict of interest between these two states. And so the argument isn't that liberal democracies and autocratic regimes will always be at war, or that they can't enjoy relations, right? On the one hand, a highly autocratic regime can, be more easily co-opted. It might be that, and this gets to this kind of paternalistic civilizational language in liberalism, this idea that, well, this country needs a strong hand, something the United States said with regard to Iraq throughout the 80s. But the argument is that when a conflict of interest emerges, this cognitive frame facilitates a rapid deterioration in bilateral relations. So rather than being a constant, and we can think of this, right, when something bad happens, what's your go-to analogy? What's the sort of frame you use? What trends in thinking do you rely on? The argument is that this is readily available and kind of built in. So when something happens, there's some disagreement, this really makes it easy to go from 0 to 60. And one of the interesting things I found in the cases was that oftentimes what flipped the switch wasn't some big action, but some relatively small agreement that kind of turned the tables between these two states.
Okay. So I'm not capable of listening to Maddie and reading the questions, so I'm just going to read the question out, and I'm just going to hope there's no four-letter words in it. As you previously mentioned, ethnocentrism plays a key role in preferring democracy. If we view the U.S. as acting in a non-democratic manner, yet still engaging in intervention under the guise of democratization, how might we reconcile the view of white Western nations as democratic, their domestic behavior, and the rhetoric surrounding intervention? Maddie, what do you think?
Sorry, I want to make sure I...
So let's talk about like what in your book, what did you find? Race isn't a central theme. But the whole civilizational discourse is probably there, right?
Absolutely.
What did you find? What were your thoughts? Or what are your thoughts about that? We all make choices about what we're gonna. There's all like when we go through a record, we have to tell a story, and you're trying to tell the story that doesn't do violence to the history, and yet at the same time is coherent enough to bring across to people, and that's the tricky part about qualitative research. So,
Absolutely. And I would say this is a really important part of the story. I would say it isn't, not that it's not sufficient, but this doesn't apply to, there are cases we can come up with, Hitler in Germany, of course, Putin today, that don't fall into the same racialization process. So this isn't to say that this isn't playing a role in aggravating these dynamics, but rather that they can exist independent from them, or they are not, don't always have to be there. So truth be told, this is was my dissertation project, which then became the book. I was limited in what I was told I could work on. Understandably, there's already too many moving parts in it, but I do think race plays an important role. And if you look at the discourse that these leaders were using in the Gulf War, I mean, then in 2003 and in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, it is very challenging to disaggregate race. But I will say, oftentimes this is embedded with this kind of civilizational tutelage that's consistent with liberalism. So I was able to try to thread that needle that way, but I would say this is absolutely playing a role, and I would say generally augmenting the threat, or strengthening it, I would say, in countries or against countries who are highly racialized.
mm-hmm. Yeah, what I found, what you find when you do this work on the public opinion is when you ask people, if you're asking people about a hypothetical adversary, using the prompt that people oftentimes use to try to figure out whether ordinary people think of the world in terms of democracies and non-democracies. If you mention nuclear proliferation, it's always Iran, right? It's always Iran. It's what they know, right? And that's the thing. Like I think and it helps answer your question for whatever because of past history, certain countries come to represent the unreliable dictator or the dictator regime, and like everyone in the U.S. knows that Iran is bad, and I shouldn't put it in quotation mark because Iran is bad, but or their government is bad. But it's like, but they wouldn't know anything about any of the governments. They certainly don't know what's going on in Iraq anymore, right?
No.
They don't know anything. But there are certain things that they know and that they go to, and it's a cognitive shortcut of its own. What do you think about what do you think about what's happening within democracies themselves when it comes to this? The contestation of, I guess, of democratic solidarity with like the stuff that I started talking about.
Yeah, I think I think one of the things we're seeing, and I think you pointed this out, and this has always been the case, when we talk about, for example, so when Bolsonaro left office and Lula in Brazil came back, one of the things that was interesting was how, at least in the United States, democracy in Brazil was discussed. And don't get me wrong, the democratization only happened in the 80s, and there's a lot of challenges there. But there was often described this kind of foregone conclusion that there wasn't going to be a peaceful transfer of power, that this was going to be a big problem, but this would never happen in the United States. And so I'd say these kind of like racialized relationships, how true democracies are imagined, is often connoted with North American and Western European. And I would say that exactly as you mentioned, in the Trump administration, now they've kind of taken away the word democracy, and now we're just calling, right, for civilizational allies. So I think within democracies, especially these democracies in North America and Western Europe, we're seeing tension in the relationships. In part, I think that is exactly over what commonalities they share. Is that democracy and liberalism, or is that, right, a white civilizationalism, which Trump is articulating? At the same time, we haven't talked. Our colleague Manjari unfortunately couldn't be here. But democracies in the global South, we're seeing, I think, a different conversation and an interesting one, but one that I wouldn't say is necessarily animated by these dynamics I describe. In part because the identity there is very different.
Yeah. So Manjari wasn't able to come tonight. she's dead to us now. No, she had laryngitis, and we wish her the best, obviously. But she would say, is like, this democratic peace thing is just BS, right?
Yeah.
Because she's a student of Indian foreign policy and Chinese foreign policy, but from an Indian perspective, right, they've been waiting for the democratic peace for a long time, right? Like, what about us? And they always, because of their position in the Cold War in particular, I think but also the racial difference, also I think the fact that they were a former British colony, they've always been on the outside.
Absolutely. And was it in 1972, right, the Nixon administration wanted to intervene on behalf of Pakistan. They didn't ultimately, but the fact that the desire was
So much
there-
for the democratic peace.
Exactly,
yeah.
so much for the democratic peace. And so I think it really, right, it's very much laden with this kind of racialized context.
So another question from the audience, and I'm mindful of the time because we don't have the three panelists. I think we'll just go for a couple more minutes here. This is the question: if the violation of norms is why liberal democracies fight personalized autocracies, can one say that the urge to fight is inherent to liberal democracies? Can that urge be unlearned? And I think the answer is kind of in the book. There's like, no, because this is a particular understanding of the relationship between liberal regimes and autocracies. It's a very historically contingent one, even though that historical contingency lasted for a good long period of time. But what do you think the right balance? Because this goes back to what you're saying before. Like, what's the guiding principle? What does non-dangerous liberalism look like as a guiding force in foreign policy? You know what I'm saying? Right. How do you tease out that crusading impulse, which is, I think, what's underlying a lot of the dynamics you're describing?
Definitely. I think this is so hard in part because liberalism liberalism in the context of kind of Enlightenment thought, how it emerged, right? There is this missionary zeal, right? And kind of Kant's What is Enlightenment and Perpetual Peace, he talks about this civilizing tutelage and having to, right, remove the barriers to enlightenment for others. And implicitly, there are those that are capable of enlightenment and those who are not. And so there's paternalism and hierarchy and mission kind of imbricated in liberalism itself. So it can be difficult to disaggregate. That being said, I think, we have seen evolution in the concept and the understanding to become more multicultural. And there's been great work on looking at liberalism and multiculturalism. So exactly as you said, I don't think it's stagnant. I think thinking about what are the aspects of this that we want to save, we want to preserve, and I think rights and freedoms, of course, should be central to this. And trying to disaggregate them. And I think there are other traditions we can look to, and also looking at historically marginalized perspectives on liberalism is a really interesting place to start. So I know, feminist critiques of liberalism have, brought forward a lot of really interesting questions, or scholars from the Global South who've been engaging in these questions and critiques of liberalism. They can oftentimes point out the things, I'll say myself as an American, sometimes you're socialized in too deeply to see yourself. And that's, I think, can be a helpful place to start.
Yeah, one option, just brought up by one of the cards here, so that the question is, USA in Israel bombing Iran to protect democracy without bringing this up in the United Nations is not very democratic, right? So there is an academic literature that basically says we can't understand multilateralism as a phenomenon that emerges, really post-1945, but of course, going back to the League of Nations and some of the earlier covenants, right? But this emphasis of the expression of democracy and really liberalism as the institution of an international rule of law, right? But what you're describing is a very unilateral, heavy, right? What we use needs naturally to a kind of unilateralism, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and and we could think of like a safer although I wouldn't put any money on it right now, right? A safer version of liberalism, right, is it's natural, to some degree natural, but nothing's natural about liberalism. That's the thing. It can go in all of these different directions. It's historically contingent, and that's what I'd like all of you to, one lesson I'd like, especially with the students, to bring home, right, is that like it's a matter of agency, it's a matter of context. We shouldn't understand democracy in an ahistorical way, but it does have within it certain ingredients that can be put together, right, to lead to foreign policy, very different types, all of them liberal in a certain way. But one of them is multilateralism and the focus on the rule of law, because there's a way in which that even more than democracy, the rule of law is the true instantiation, right? And rule of law, not rule by law. We want to distinguish between the personalist dictator who says, yeah, I got a law for that, right? And does what he or she wants, generally he, right? And the rule of law, which is that everybody, even the most powerful people, right? And then as you project that in the international system, right? The idea is that everybody has to live by certain restraints, and that you could put a certain, straitjacket on the worst impulses of liberalism. Anyways, I'd like to thank Maddie for being part of our first Frank Woods Lectureship Conversation, which is something that I hope to continue to be able to do alongside the more traditional Frank Woods lecture, which will be more of like a prize lecture. Maddie, thanks for being our first guest.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks you all for coming. And remember, Maddie's got books to sell out there, and you all have money to burn. So don't forget about that. And if you're really, really nice to her, I'm sure she'll sign it for you. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.